Welcome, everybody, to our next event, Infrastructure Under Siege. I have today with me a wonderful guest, an expert in the field. I'm just going to read some of his bona fides, and then we'll open it up to discussion. Dr. David Mussington currently serves as the Executive Assistant Director for Infrastructure Security at the Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Security Agency, CISA. Since 2021, he's been leading CISA's efforts to secure the nation's critical infrastructure in coordination with government and the private sector. Immediately prior to joining CISA, Dr. Mussington was professor of the practice and director for the Center for Public Policy and Private Enterprise at UMaryland School of Public Policy. He has been at RAND, where he led counterterrorism and cybersecurity studies for the Department of Defense, the Department of Transportation, and Amtrak. And he's been also at the Institute for Defense Analyses. And if I were to cover the rest of it, we'd be here for some time. So welcome, Dr. Mussington. It's a real pleasure to have you here.
Pleasure to participate. Thanks, Patrick.
My pleasure. So I recently dug in a little bit on some of your writings. I was absolutely fascinated. I read one called Strategic Stability, Cyber Operations, and International Security, and you said something very trenchant that I see in play everywhere in cyber risk management. So I just wanted to sort of ground us in this.
Sure.
You said that the rapid rate of technological change inevitably outpaces government and society's ability to comprehend that change. Can you maybe talk a little bit about how CISA and those in cyber approach this existential fact and hopefully speed or enable comprehension?
Sure. I mean, I think first, thanks for the opportunity to speak on these topics. It's fascination of mine professionally and personally. I think the pace of technological change is driven by the private markets, which produce products and services innovatively and with a profit motive that reinforces speed to market. Governments and bureaucracies don't operate at that up-tempo. They are legacy mostly in terms of their organization, the training of their staff, and the metrics they use to measure success. So what you have is, in a sense, a collision between bureaucratic, governmental, and private sector, because it's not just government, modes of doing things and the potentials that technologies enable, often with consumers being ahead, and certainly with innovative firms being ahead. That creates opportunities and risk. The opportunities are why technology is uptaken in the first place. The risks are the exploitability of those new technologies by adversaries. So that's where CISA tries to make a contribution by anticipating risks and by helping consumers and stakeholders to deal with exploitation as it occurs.
Excellent. So you have spoken and written at length on the relatively low barrier to entry that attackers face in cyber. That fact, coupled with the ever-expanding attack surface from cloud, IoT, ICT, and the internet, makes for a dynamic and unpredictable environment. So given the growing number of attacks on critical infrastructure, what shifts have you seen in the types of cyber threats targeting these systems over the past few years?
So I think first I have to say that the barriers to entry continue to be low, but what we have is a migration of technique from the more advanced attackers, nation states perhaps, to criminals and anarchists or others of that ilk who want to disrupt systems for reputational purposes. In terms of ransomware and denials of service, they may do it for money. They may do it as proxies or cutouts working for nation states, applying the same techniques in each of those actor spaces. So if you can download a tool that allows you to inject ransomware into a hospital or a school or a police department, all of which are real examples, then you can mimic the behavior of a more advanced actor without any of the expertise. Right? You can even buy these sorts of services on the dark web. That means that not very sophisticated people can place at risk or hold hostage very significant infrastructure, from medical care to personal finance, identity theft being a part of the equation here. So that means not just barriers to entry, it means that the level of activity is also rising, so that the ambient threat to everyone is rising. And that's why CISA tries to coordinate with public-private partners, public in terms of state, local, territorial, and tribal governments,
Mhm.
federal in terms of the interagency, private in terms of the private sector, which owns most of the assets at risk. That's the collaborative space where we try to operate to transmit risk insights and resilience insights, so that if people are victimized, they get to recover. And to prevent victimization is really the sort of key efficiency that we bring.
That's great. So you've described basically the industrialization of the APT in a sense, and how they can use affiliates to scale some of their the malevolent, malicious things they do. What role does proper cyber risk management have to play in cutting through the fog and helping critical infrastructure prioritize how they harden systems?
The first thing that a defender or an asset owner can do is understand the systems they use to execute their business or to serve their customers. That means identifying at-risk systems at the most mundane level, identifying systems that are exposed to the public internet. So if you have assets with IP addresses, which can be scanned remotely, then you're presenting an attack surface to the adversary that may be exploitable. For example, if the systems you present to the public internet aren't patched properly, once the scan reveals what those systems are, an exploit might be applied to those systems and you might be suffer a compromise as a result. So identification of one's exposed attack surface is the first thing. Then analysis of what that exposure means. Is the exposure essential to your business? If it isn't, then cut it off. If it is, then look for mitigations to reduce the risk of those assets being on the public internet. Analysis of logs and threat history. Everyone gets visited when they have open access to the internet. So have you been visited by threat actors before? Have your patches or your firewall prevented victimization? That's important because it tells you what you need to keep updated in order to remain safe. Analysis of what's happened to others who are like you who have been less lucky. So the risk history of other people, people are victimized by either denials of service, poorly designed software, or ransomware that successfully gets through defenses. The cautionary tale of your neighbor that unfortunately has to pay a ransom. And by the way, if you pay a ransom, that invariably means that you don't get back your data. Certainly changes the, it makes it easier to make the security argument if you see your neighbor got hacked. Just say it that way. And often, absent your neighbor getting hacked, you might find it inconvenient to deploy the defenses that you would otherwise.
Right.
So those if you are victimized, by the way, someone tries to victimize you and you successfully deflect them away, lessons learned of what happened so that you can roll that back into your planning. Planning of continuously available defenses is essential in order to make sure that you don't become a platform to attack someone else, or so that you aren't victimized yourself.
Fascinating. That's really.
If I can just add one point that notices, we published something called the known exploited vulnerabilities list, the KEV list, which if anybody follows me on LinkedIn, they'll see that most of my LinkedIn posting these days is about additions to the KEV list.
Right.
Now, the KEV list is known, well-known, long-lived exploitable vulnerabilities in internet exposed systems. Some of these have been on the list for years.
Yeah.
So if a vulnerability is known for years that exploitable, is in continuous ongoing exploitation, and you have unpatched systems, then you are vulnerable to being victimized. So
absolutely,
that's a good list, a good map.
Great list. It's a great list.
Doing the smart thing, which is, if it's got a high criticality score on that list, maybe that should be on your list to do something.
Yes. And you mentioned that list. It's a great list. We work with that list. We build that list into some of the larger models we use. So we're very grateful to you and your wonderful professionals over there for providing
one of our most popular advisors.
Yep, and for good reason. Because there are maybe 260,000 vulnerabilities out there, and the KEV list is just a great filter to actually start to prioritize the things that are exploited in the wild and that are out there, and it can really add to the efficiency of vulnerability
management. That's the point. Security is often interpreted as a burden, and the more efficiency you can introduce into actually interacting with risks and reducing them, not eliminating them, because we're professionals, but we're not magicians. We can't make them go away. But we can try and make the defense a little bit more capable, so that you at least have a plan to wrap around the vulnerabilities that you need to deal with.
Absolutely. And it's related to some of where in the private sector we see things headed now, which is executives are asking for the ability to prioritize based on the business and the business needs. And frequently that's a conversation around which things do we prioritize first? What is the expense? What is our return on investment? So the CAV catalog is really a big part of that. So just a little detour here. We've seen some announcements over the last year or two that, certain actors are inside systems. They're in there. It seems to some extent that maybe it's just espionage or, hopefully that it's like that. So what does Volt Typhoon mean for critical infrastructure, and how can government agencies help to mitigate on this front as well?
So Volt Typhoon suggests objectives other than simply espionage. So first, we've issued serial advisories with our Five Eyes colleagues that interpret this behavior as more malign in intent, although espionage is enough. Some of the targets exploited by Volt Typhoon actors are not seen as typical espionage targets. They seem more likely to be explainable by let me backtrack and say it more simply. Volt Typhoon's about enumerating and achieving persistent access to critical infrastructure for other purpose, leverageable for purposes in the future. Now, what are those purposes? Those purposes might be denials of service. They might be just holding those assets at risk. These assets are typically important. They're in US critical infrastructure, and actors that don't like our policies or want to stop us from doing things may leverage those accesses to disrupt actual military or defense activity at a time of their choosing. That's why Volt Typhoon is particularly taken very seriously by us and our allies.
Right.
Espionage is one thing, data theft is another. Volt Typhoon is a third thing that in interpretation is very significant, very serious, and something that we pay a lot of attention to, as do our principal partners, public and private sector.
Excellent. So let's just transition a little bit and talk about CISA's role in protecting infrastructure. So how has the agency's approach to securing critical infrastructure evolved in response to this increasing threat landscape?
So I think that it's fair to say that over the 5 years of the agency, the approach has migrated principally from a all hazards, cyber inclusive set of risk concerns to a predominantly cyber set of risk concerns, with all hazards still present. But the rise of nation-state threat, peer competition between ourselves, the People's Republic of China, Iran, North Korea, and others, has increased the centrality of nation-state threat as the sort of driving requirement for CISA to be effective. Hence the Volt Typhoon and other risk characterization activity that we do. We also have a role as national coordinator for infrastructure security and resilience, for cybersecurity and infrastructure security and resilience. What that means is that we coordinate with other sector risk management agencies. We have 16 critical infrastructures. We're the SRMA for 8 of them. But in the areas of energy and transportation, that's DOT, TSA, and the Department of Energy. We coordinate with them to make sure of a couple of things. One, consistency of assessments of risk in those sector domains. So if we characterize risk in one place, it should be comparable, the methods we use, to what's done in a different domain. There's also, under National Security Memorandum 22 from August of this year, April of this year, a requirement to do sector risk management plans for each of those sectors. So a risk baseline, then creating plans to reduce risk from that baseline over a period of time. So CISA coordinates that to make sure that those sector risk management plans broadly move in the same direction defined by policy from the White House. We have domain expertise in things like chemical, for example, in dams, in communications. We're the SRMA. in other areas. We're in support of other SRMAs, for example, in water and wastewater treatment. EPA is the SRMA, so we provide whatever support that EPA determines is necessary to meet their responsibilities. So, we sort of refine methodologies, we assist through cross-domain expertise, and we have some tools that we can use to incentivize the private sector to collaborate with us, which is what's essential to our work.
Wonderful. Yeah. And there was a lot in that answer. But the idea of, establishing a consistent approach to risk assessment and then planning, there's a lot in that as well. So what are some of the key initiatives today that are top of mind for you and CISA?
Well, for CISA, other than trying to maintain consistency across SRMAs so that progress in one part of cybersecurity isn't diluted by slower progress somewhere else, we're trying to look at signal initiatives, zero trust being one of them, the secured by design initiatives being another, trying to shift the responsibility or accountability of fixing system weaknesses to those who design and introduce new technologies into the marketplace. It's our position that holding consumers responsible for patching software and systems that are already deployed is sort of inefficient, since they know less about those technologies than the people who sold them to them. So focusing on design principles for key systems and software that are designed to be safe, designed to be well documented, software bill of materials being a part of that kind of initiative, where future lifecycle system and software risk management can be executed possibly by third parties, but definitely in the context of an enumerated framework, so that you're not going through some sort of random walk to sort of decompile unsafe software. So standards for software design, standards for software deployment, greater accountability of C-level officials who may not be technical. So that's sort of a process step where companies that use technology that they only partially understand get better at that, and trying to provide a venue with the private sector to exchange insights about both victimization and about how to design software and hardware according to standards. So we have a cybersecurity division here at CISA, and we have a joint cyber defense collaborative here at CISA, where technology vendors and producers can talk in a non-competitive, mutually productive way about how to reduce risk to their customers. All of those things contribute to, I think, a better public conversation about risk management in cyberspace.
Fascinating. Yes. And, NIST has done some good work there as well on software bill of materials and secure software design.
Yeah, Alan Friedman here, Dr. Alan Friedman is sort of the lead for software bills of materials here, my former NIST person. And we leverage NIST, especially the cybersecurity framework and the 800.51.53 series.
Yep.
To great effect. I mean, those are the standards where we articulate the best practices that we try and propagate.
Yeah, they're also really core to our product as well. I mean, we were deeply appreciative of the work and the research that NIST has done. We participated in many of the events. So I just want to transition over to an area that I'm absolutely fascinated by, because I build models that, sort of operationalize threat intelligence. And how did the executive order of 2021 shape some of those initiatives you talked about, and perhaps improve areas like threat intel sharing?
Well, I think that being more data-driven is central here. It's one thing to have hypotheses about what kind of risk activity there. Quite another to instrument and sense the environment so that you can tell what's happening, and then do quasi-experiments. I used to be a social scientist a long time ago, and obviously in social science you can't do pure experiments because you lack data and you have those pesky humans that interfere with your random experiments. But the more modeling you can do of critical infrastructure processes, the better. And getting sense data of what adversary behavior is in the wild, both successful and unsuccessful, allows you to be more systematic about where risk is, how to patch it, and what the interdependencies are between risk sources. Here I have in mind interdependent critical infrastructures, which present different risk profiles to adversaries. That presents a model, in a sense, an exploitation model to an adversary that they can try and refine over time.
Right.
Up until recently, defenders had not had that sort of data available as a counterpoint. So the generalization is offense dominance in cyber.
Right.
Well, maybe that's true. Maybe that doesn't have to be as true. And creating better data, better better visibility of active exploitation of key systems and critical infrastructure leads to their enhanced defensibility. So strategy since the executive order you named, and the preceding national strategies for cyberspace,
Right.
cyber defense, means that things are better defended because we understand the defensive perimeter and challenge better. So that points to a better demand signal for tooling, a better demand signal for measuring the effectiveness of the tools that we claim to have. One concern I have around here, and luckily threat hunters at CISA are very good at this, is making sure that the models we use are up to date to the threat environment we have to operate in.
Right.
And we don't pick that. Obviously, the adversary has a vote in that.
Right.
But making sure that we're actually sensing the environment as it is versus as it was 6 months ago. There is a difference. And the difference, even though that KEV list is still there as an exploitable map for the adversary.
Yeah.
Our problem is actually that well, by the hour, I mean those interested in defending US critical infrastructure. Our problem is that we actually make it a little bit too easy for adversaries. They don't have to be as advanced as they might actually be, because we leave vulnerabilities unaddressed that they can victimize us with.
Right.
And any vulnerability that's been on our list that's publicly known for more than a year, well, how much of a trial is that to an APT level adversary or somebody who mimics their techniques? So anyway, all of that is to say that we need the ecosystem to be more transparent to the defender, so that we can use good data and tools to as a counterpoint to the offensive advantages of attackers. That's our objective. That's what drives our public-private partnership work. It drives our incident response and support to victimized critical infrastructure. It drives what we do with partners internationally, Five Eyes and other. Drives what we do in the federal space, in the FSEB, where we are sort of the coordinator for federal civilian executive branch agencies in this area.
Yeah, and I'm picking up on some themes, transparency, visibility, and good data, recent data being very, very important. They're also a big part of what we look at as well. So to that end, what are some, successful examples of some of the partnerships that have enhanced security efforts, and how can we just, as a community, also improve collaboration moving forward?
I think, one thing that in the 3.5 years or so that I've been here, I've seen sort of a flowering of the public-private partnership trust model. It's one thing to talk about exchanging data in the abstract. It's quite another to tactically exchange data while you're trying to remediate an incident. And that's where we've made some progress through the Joint Cyber Defense Collaborative and through more active, more proactive engagement with victimized companies, both vendors and their customers. So that's been one area where we've made some progress. I think articulating best practices for cloud instances, for AI, and for zero trust has us giving basic models that can be adapted for different industry domains. I think that's another area. I think in articulating workforce needs that we have, that the private sector may also have, we can talk about sort of through the NICE framework and others, what kind of staff and workforce we need and what that means in terms of professional development. Because the best thing we can do is develop capability in the private sector with which we can partner. So anything we can do to contribute to that is useful. We also, honestly, compete with the private sector for good people. So that means that we share an interest in developing an ecosystem that creates positive career experiences for technical folks who can make a real contribution to companies and to the country's cybersecurity. I think that the overarching biggest contribution we make, because a lot of this is more technical and is driven by the market, is an awareness of what threat actors want to do when they exploit vulnerabilities. And for us, as I said at the start, it's nation states and people who emulate their best attack behavior that are strategic threats to US critical infrastructure. That is our focus. It's not the focus of everyone.
Right.
Everyone can make an incremental contribution. We try and knit together those different contributions into a coherent whole that benefits all of the American people's critical infrastructure dependencies. So, you know, we place a value on being open. We're a young agency, not the youngest anymore. I'm sure there are agencies less than 5 years old. But you know, a lot of outreach to state, local, territorial, and tribal governments. A lot of it outreach to small to medium-sized enterprises, and a lot of outreach to universities. I was just in an HBCU conference yesterday talking about cyber and physical infrastructure vulnerability and what we could do to partner. And many of those partners are quite sophisticated, but you know, they know more about their industry domain than we do. We know more about maybe nation state threat than they do. So join those two insights together, we can both be smarter.
That's great. That's wonderful. Yeah, and the importance of human resources and growing the cyber leaders we need in the future, and the analysts, and the list goes on and on. There's cyber always has a very important human component.
You know what? One sort of other theme we try and do is we try and sort of enrich the public debate about cybersecurity. You know, in a prior job a long time ago at DoD, we used to sort of bemoan the fact that cyber hygiene was not improving. Why don't people have better passwords? Why don't people detect phishing emails? Why don't people why do people plug their phones into other devices that they shouldn't plug them into? And we kept telling people to do these things, and they wouldn't do them, or they do them at a rate that didn't seem to impede the adversary. That's what makes us think that the accountability at the consumer level is not where you get bang for the buck. I mean, it's important, but it's necessary but not sufficient. So cyberspace itself is a plastic environment with technologies, protocols, and workflows, which are human creations. We can engineer security into these things in a more deliberate way. That's the way you get to sort of these secular improvements in security that we need. Not by sort of getting on your soapbox and telling people to have that may work a little bit, but it's not going to, you know, it's not convergent on the threat that we've confronted.
No, I love the concept of plasticity, you know, neuroplasticity and cyberplasticity. I think that's a wonderful way to think about it. I've seen that.
It's also sort of convergent on the shift from hardware to cloud or cloud native applications that instantiate themselves in critical infrastructure in different ways. That means that the security discourse or narrative probably needs to change as that cloud instance interacts with real physical systems, which are different in nuclear power generation, for example, than they would be in transportation. And acting as if everything's the same is not very practical or even true.
No.
So that kind of plasticity means that attackers have options. It also means defenders have options if they apply the right technique. I'm an optimist when it comes to artificial intelligence. I do. We need to be optimistic because what's the alternative? But you know, the defender has a chance to get back into this by the ability to use data at scale to adapt general technique to specific circumstances. From water and wastewater treatment systems to software in a variety of high criticality instances like public health or defense or energy. And done the right way, the attacker's problem gets more difficult faster than the defender's options to defend. That's what the task is. It's to shift that balance so that even though we say this domain's offense dominant, it's not as dominant. So defenders can be in the game, in the contest a little bit longer.
Right. Now that last bit you just shared is a very active area for us, and I think for a lot of people in cyber. You know, the hope for the future and leveraging some of the new tools that are out there. You know, the complexity and data at scale, huge issues. And I share your optimism. I believe that some of the models and solutions that we're working on now just as an industry, and here at our company, we'll have a serious contribution to this. You know some things that I come across just in my day to day, when I'm at conferences, when I'm speaking to other professionals, and one of the things I used to get asked a lot in the press was to tell reporters, describe to reporters why OT systems are so darned hard to explain. And you've worked inside, large scale OT systems. So, in train transportation, chemical facilities, you've seen these operations, you've seen the devices, the machines, some of the complexity. So why do you think OT systems are so difficult to understand and secure?
So I think they're difficult to understand because we often take an IT model and we think
Mhm.
it must apply everywhere without change. And I've already
Mhm.
said that you need to adapt cybersecurity best practices to a specific industry domain. So
Right.
OT systems have a couple of characteristics that make them a hard example, an edge example of this. First, they're very long lived. They don't turn over every 3 to 6 months or on some sort of depreciation scale that people use for their taxes. That's not it. So OT systems are often decades old.
Mhm.
The people who purchase them want a return on investment on the capital that they put in. And that means that they expect them to operate properly without a lot of nitty-gritty intervention every couple of months.
Right.
They also have to operate all the time to deliver services, critical services. Think of chemical processing, think of electric power, think of water and wastewater treatment. Systems that have uptime of months to years
Mhm.
don't get taken down to patch.
Right.
Don't get reboots, don't get software updates every 90 days, every Wednesday or something. That have very few actual users. They have a lot of customers, but very few users.
Right.
You've got lumpy capital investments here, often by because these systems are often very automated. Not many people just expect them to use. They're always on systems by definition,
Mhm.
and their connection to the broader internet may be. Well, in fact, I've seen examples where people say we aren't connected to the internet. Then you show them that they are, and I won't give any specific examples of that because they be bad. But bottom line is often the internet dependencies of these things are obscure.
Mhm.
So when you say to them, have a long password, patch your internet device, they may literally not know what you're talking about.
Right.
A long password, they may be passwordless, or they may be passworded at the factory with a burned-in password that isn't
Right.
changeable by the
Right.
operator. Now, that may be bad practice on IT. In OT, there actually can be safety and security reasons for doing that. I'm not really convinced by them, but I'm
Mhm.
told by people that there are, and people who are more technical than I am, that's what they've been doing for decades anyway, irrespective of my opinion.
Mhm.
You may also have systems that don't have easy substitutes. You don't have an IT substitute that can be connected to substitute for an OT system that's taken offline. What about the customers? What about a water and wastewater treatment system that can't function because you've decided to take it offline?
Right.
That mean that it's bottled water for people? Does that mean that a fab in a fabrication plant can't operate because specialty chemicals can't be moved and
Mhm.
flow properly because something's happened to a system and no alternative exists? So the absence of redundancy in those systems also makes them much tougher to secure,
Mhm.
um, especially when you've got some of these facilities that are long-lived and extremely expensive. So that you've got, especially if it's a public sector authority, public sector may not want to put a bond issue in to replace a piece of infrastructure that, by the way, can still be working.
Right.
If it hasn't been exploited, the credibility of your saying it could be exploited by somebody, um, it's out there. It's a finite risk. Obviously, it's a real risk. But if it's a risk that occurs every 20 years, every 10 years in their minds, how
Mhm.
do you convince them to take a revenue producing asset offline so that you can secure it when they don't have a redundant alternative to keep customers well lit or service provided? So I think all those things make OT different and more problematic to handle than IT.
Very, very clear description of some of
I should
the.
also add that the
Yeah.
OT in defense, the
Mhm.
defense industries, is a special case again, because many
Yes.
of those systems are ones and twos, don't
Mhm.
have a civilian analog. and aren't subject to civilian sort of risk calculus.
Right.
That could be a SAP or something, but they just aren't operated in the same way.
Right.
They may be fundamentally important to some mission that somebody has that isn't publicly appreciated.
Right. Right. Understood. Yeah. Very, very clarifying. I mean, in an area that I think, some of the broader culture has difficulty understanding. So thank you for that. So we're getting near the end, and I just would like to thank you very much for sharing. This has been enlightening, enlivening, all the rest. I have just one last question to toss at you. So, the future on infrastructure security, as we look to it, what trends are you looking to, and what does the future look like for the agency and for just critical infrastructure generally?
Well, for the agency, we're going to leverage public-private partnerships to become or remain and enhance our availability to our customers and to our stakeholders, those who are interested in enhancing critical infrastructure security and resilience for the American people. I should say, we focus a lot on machines and process that provide services, but this is really about making sure that there's reliable, available resourcing from critical infrastructure to serve our economy and our national security. So, we experiment, we have products and advisories that we'll continue to issue, tracking threat trends, trying to anticipate them when we can. I think on the things like software by design, software secure by design, secure by demand, on demand, we're trying to enrich the market's ability to anticipate threat and risk and respond adequately as a market. The notion of a market failure where the market does not provide less vulnerable technologies is something that we need to help address through providing information and advisories and collaborative opportunities with the private sector. So this joint learning rather than just us. We aren't a regulator, by the way.
Right.
It's not us regulating the private sector into sort of compliance or something. It's not what we do. What we do is we try and jointly learn about risks as it affects critical infrastructure and then collaboratively design remediations. I think that there's some technical progress in artificial intelligence and just in better use of data for risk management that can make us better at doing that. And again, make us faster so that we can do a better job of trying to keep up with an offense that still has some important advantages. I think that to those who are least well equipped to defend themselves, small to medium-sized enterprise, school systems, those who are just less technically or less resource endowed to defend themselves, we owe a duty to stand in their stead, to be their protector. And that drives a lot of our mission orientation as well. There's, CISA's got 3,200 odd people, about half of which work on the cyber mission space. Pretty motivated group. It's a really motivated mission set, and we are determined to make sure that the American people are better protected from cyber risks and more aware of those cyber risks so that we can collaboratively achieve more security. I think that's it.
Well, Dr. David Mussington, grateful for the agency, grateful for your presence today and your expertise. Fascinating conversation, and thank you to the guests, and we'll wrap there.
Thanks.
Thanks, everybody.